One thing I think we can all agree on is that Avatar is just good right from the get-go. Everything from the premise to the main characters to even the magic system, the series doesn't really have some just watch until episode X to be hooked. It's just good. That being said though, Book 1 is by far the safest with its pseudo-adventure of the week approach. And it's not until Book 2 that we really see the story begin to flex its world and its characters. Episodes like the Tales of Ba Sing Se and Appa's Last Days are both excellent examples of that. But even before those, there is another episode that works as this sort of transitionary period for the different kinds of stories we'd be seeing from now on. That episode is Zuko Alone. And actually, I think that's the best place to begin. The implications of this episode and its placement in the grander story that is Avatar. Like I mentioned a second ago, while Book 1 does establish a number of long-term goals very early on, purely on an episode-to-episode basis, the events are not really meaningfully connected. It was designed as episodic adventures that loosely connected into a bigger story. With Book 2 on the other hand, we open with an immediate follow-up to where we left off in Book 1. Right away, we see Bato sending the gang into the Earth Kingdom in search of a master. So we already have the long-term goal of mastering earthbending and the Avatar states, while also having a very straightforward, immediate A to B story in meeting Fong. Ditto for episodes like Return to Omashu. With Book 1's structure of this adventure of the week, they never reuse locations. Whereas here, well, the clue is in the name, it's Return to Omashu. So again, the narrative structure has shifted. The reason I bring all of this up is because I think it's very important to acknowledge just how bold a lot of these moves were considering Nickelodeon's MO at the time. Going from a show where you can tune in on whatever episode, a la SpongeBob, The Fairly OddParents, or Jimmy Neutron, to one with a clear underlying narrative was a very big ask. But what was an even bigger ask was saying it's time to lock in. Not only are we going to make an episode that is far slower with very little shiny explosive conflict, it's also going to be almost entirely psychological in nature. It's not going to feature any of the main protagonists, and you know what? It'll center around the, I guess now, secondary antagonist, but really it's like the primary antagonist. It's easy to look back at it now and be like, yeah, obviously we needed another Zuko episode a la The Storm. But to be perfectly honest with you, the fact that this episode exists is still kind of unbelievable to me. Especially considering what happened to Nickelodeon's programming with their super homogenized SpongeBob 24/7 programming. And I mean, you don't even need to step outside of the Avatar IP to see what this means. Just look at how they handled Korra. To think that Book 2 not only got an entire structural shift, but also an episode like Zuko Alone, I think just shows an insane amount of faith in the vision that was presented. Production things aside though, I also want to briefly talk about the title of Zuko Alone. Firstly, purely on a surface level, using one of the main characters' names as the episode title kind of does immediately tell you that this is going to be really important. I'm sure most of you have noticed, but both Avatar as well as just a ton of fiction in general will always use somewhat stylized, ambiguous titles, and even if they do refer to a single person, they might use their title or moniker rather than just a name. Think like The Blind Bandit and The Earth King. Naming an entire episode after just one character, though, immediately implies that all of the moral quandaries, all of the core themes, and just the entire narrative will revolve around just that one character. Jet is another good example of that. In Avatar, we even have a very nice little duology of Aang going from just a boy in the iceberg in episode 1 to the very explicit Avatar Aang in the series finale. So with Zuko Alone, even before you see like a single frame of the episode, you can fully expect a lot of flashbacks, more callbacks to Iroh's teachings, and everything here will be about Zuko. And speaking of, I think the title of Zuko Alone also holds a double meaning. Obviously, Zuko is physically alone, and this episode tells the story of his pseudo-nomadic lifestyle, so that's one meaning. But this is Avatar, and many of the titles are used very purposely. So I think you could also interpret this title as him feeling alone after their mother left them. Throughout this entire story thus far, we've seen Zuko ramble on about regaining his honor, about getting his father's respect, about reclaiming his place on the throne, and everything else. But in this episode, we begin to learn that all of that is just desperately trying to fill in the gap left behind by his mother, the only person who he felt like truly loved him. We'll get to this later in the episode, but I think him splitting up with Iroh is like the perfect example of that self-destructive cycle that he finds himself in. He desperately wants to find his place in the world, to find someone who truly cares for him. He wants to learn what happened to his mother. How could she of all people just leave him? But at the same time, he is also weirdly afraid of any real connection. He pushes Iroh away, he pushes Katara away, later in Book 3, he even pushes Mei away. He feels so alone, while simultaneously pushing everything and everyone away. Because what if? What if capturing Aang will finally get him his father's affection? What if it could fill that gap? But what if the people he gets close to leave him again? What if there is no real connection and Zuko is destined to be alone? Now I'm getting ahead of myself, but yeah, I'd go as far as to say that the second most important character in this episode after Zuko himself is not Lee, not the soldiers, and not Iroh or anyone really. I think it is Ursa. Finally getting into the episode though, we open with a quite miserable and bitter Zuko. This isn't the typical Western shot of the cool guy casually wandering through the deserts. Zuko is angry at where he's at, about what he's doing, and most of all, he's angry at himself. Yet again, through his own actions, he has ended up alone.
Who are you angry at, Zuko?
Everyone! I don't know!
Your uncle? Me?
No!
Answer the question. Come on, answer it.
I'm angry at myself!
Again, we'll get to this later in the episode, but throughout the first books, his twin broadswords, I think, perfectly encapsulate his inner conflicts. Both the Blue Spirits, as well as now Zuko Alone, is a story of the heart at war with itself. One side of Zuko is a firebender who, realistically, does not need the sword. But the other is this nomad just trying to break free of that birthright. It's only when those two sides meet, just like his swords, do we get the true Zuko we see in Book 3. That is a Zuko who isn't burdened by some arbitrary definition of honor, one who embraces his birthrights, while also understanding that his place currently is not in the Fire Nation. He notices a campfire with food and immediately reaches for his swords. But before he goes full Blue Spirit mode, he notices the pregnant woman that the gang would help across the Serpent's Pass and holds back. As much as it might seem obvious that he's not going to steal from a couple expecting a baby, since, that's like way beyond an antagonist and very much into full-blown villain territory, I still think there is also purposeful development here. First off, much of this episode, and Zuko's story in general, revolves around those familial bonds and how they reflect on children, something that Zuko clearly understands but hasn't really worked through himself just yet. Point being that, while he might get into some devious activities, he does still have red lines that he simply won't cross, even if his own stomach is already growling. Secondly, I think it also marks an important point of contrast in terms of Zuko showing restraint. Eventually, we'd of course see him fall back into his own methods, which is a whole different can of worms which we'll get to in due time. But unlike with the likes of Ozai and even Kid Azula, Zuko's perspective on the world has a whole lot more calculus that isn't just, does this benefit me? And that connects right to numero 3, the importance of restraint in firebending philosophy. Obligatory I have a whole video on Aang and firebending here. But much like Aang's journey in learning fire, Zuko's bending too undergoes a transformation, much of which comes down to restraint. Some of the very first scenes we see of Zuko is him firebending at the entire Southern Water Tribe without any rhyme or reason. It is just a show of force, and that is it. Kids and elderly be damned. But as we see more of Zuko, there are also distinct times of him showing restraint. He tries to save Zhao, even after he tried having him blown to smithereens. And now in this episode, he doesn't rob the family, he doesn't rob the store, he doesn't attack the soldiers. Whenever he needs something, and even when he's provoked, he shows restraint. Eventually, we of course see the final form of this with his final Agni Kai. Azula is just blasting and throwing everything at him, but he is dismantling all of those attacks piece by piece. And a beautiful connection here that I think neatly encompasses all of this is him passing through the battlefield where Wan passed away many years ago. There clearly aren't any kind of explicit references or spirit shenanigans or anything really. Most people probably don't even realize that it is in fact the same spot. But I think this being the place where a very different but also very similar Zuko is born is extremely fitting. The Zuko we see by the end of this episode is essentially a mixture of all of his personality traits blowing up in spectacular fashion. But much like the Avatar being reborn, what comes next is a different Zuko. More on that in a second. As we cut to a POV shot of him slowly beginning to lose consciousness, we suddenly get a flashback of the night his mom woke him up, said some cryptic things to his barely conscious brain, and then vanished forever. In an instant, he clenches his teeth and keeps going. I think it's this moment, the first ever time we see Ursa in the series by the way, that really begins to illuminate what truly drives Zuko beyond his usual honor ramblings. This is what's actually important to him. As his consciousness begins to slip away, the question rattling around his brain is not one of, what if I'd caught Aang? What if I hadn't disappointed my father? No, it's none of those things. It's rather, what happened to my mother? What if he never even bothered trying to fight for his father's acceptance and just focused on what he already has? What if he didn't try to show off to Azulon? What if he had simply stayed awake? What if he had gone with her? Maybe then he would know what happened to the only person who truly loved him. It's only when Zuko begins to completely break down, when his consciousness begins to betray him, and when he is truly alone, that he begins to look inward.
It's time for you to look inward. Who are you? And what do you want?
And so, he fights on. The nameless, banished prince continues to wander through the barren territories of the Earth Kingdom, searching for something, anything that just makes sense. He eventually stumbles across a small town where he tries to get some food, but quickly realizes that the economy is not doing so well. And as if that wasn't enough, a bunch of kids pull aggro from a bunch of dudes and kite them right onto Zuko. Okay, haha funnies aside, there are two big things I want to talk about here. The first is, again, that restraint angle we already talked about. Not to retread everything again, obviously, Zuko could absolutely cook these guys without breaking a sweat. But number one, he doesn't want to get the kids involved for reasons we already discussed, and two, he is actively trying to escape that pride of nobility. His brief hoarding stint in the cave with Iroh, I think, is him first lashing out against Ozai for fully disowning him to the point of sending Azula after them, as in he steals all this wealth to say, look at me, I'm still a noble, but then that illusion quickly shatters and he just now wanders around trying to figure out who he even is. If that wealth was never his, if all of it is just stolen, then what remains? Who is Zuko? But the bigger thing here, I think, is good old vignette storytelling and world building. In many other videos, I've talked about how Avatar was always very purposeful in not painting out any nation as pure good or pure bad. Neither Jet or the pirates or General Fong or Hama or Long Fang are a part of the big bad Fire Nation, but all are in some way corrupted or destructive. Same is true for the reverse. Zhang Zhang is basically a pacifist, but is obviously a firebender and ex-military to boot. And that's again what we see here. It doesn't matter which nation they belong to, they can still be, well, a bunch of douchebags exploiting already weakened people. And that then brings me onto a bigger talking point about the wider repercussions of the 100-year-long war. I think when most people hear the word war, you immediately think of a hot conflict. Siege of the North, Siege of Ba Sing Se, that type of deal. But the longer it stretches on, the less a concern the actual hot stage becomes, because society as a whole just begins to fracture. In the Southern Water Tribe, for example, Sokka is the only man left. The now empty air temples are occupied by refugees. Trade routes have been disrupted and famine becomes a real possibility. Later in the desert, we see how the Earth Kingdom military has just been completely relocated and there is no real authority in the region. But perhaps most of all, war changes the people. Obviously, Avatar is still a cartoon, so it will shy away from like explicit psychological trauma and things like that. But even so, we see how conflict does in some ways corrupt and hurt everyone, regardless of where they are. On the Fire Nation side, we have characters like Zhang Zhang, Iroh, and kinda even Zuko, who had that moment of realization, and all eventually flip sides. But they were a part of Ozai's war machine. For the rest of the world, on the other hand, the power to survive and thrive in a new and broken world becomes the single most important thing. Most of the Earth Kingdom military naturally departed for the conflict areas, but the ones that remained basically became thugs. Now, this is totally my own headcanon, but I always imagined that there must have been a natural progression here. Like, don't forget that this is a 100-year-long thing. There have been generations, right? So I think this gradual decline was, well, gradual. I think during the early days of the war, there was very good reason to make sure that the soldiers are well fed, well paid, and fully taken care of, because the town actually saw them as their protectors. But we know that the conflict never reached here. Slowly but surely, complacency took over. There was no conflict, but they still kept getting completely free preferential treatment, and everyone likes that, right? Eventually, that evolved into getting stuff for free and kinda just bossing people around, then just into straight up bullying, and then, well, here we are. They're just thugs pretending to wield some authority. It's not that they just suddenly became villains. People just really like inertia. If you're comfortable, you don't want things to change, so people in power will happily use said power to ensure that that is exactly where they remain. And that is the often unforeseen consequence of this war. Even when there is no fighting whatsoever, anyone with power still requires oversight. Otherwise, they will exercise that power that has been bestowed upon them for nothing more than personal gain. So with these thugs, I think it's just another small-scale, localized example of what is happening all across the world. When there is this external threat that you can use as a scapegoat for basically all decisions, people in power will happily exploit it. Also, there is kind of a mild plot hole here because Zuko's eyes are amber and they should immediately give away that he's a firebender, like that's an actual plot point in the novels, but okay, let's not worry about that. But my absolute favorite thing here has to be the introduction of Lee. Now, I am 99% sure none of this was ever intentional and this is just catastrophic level yapping, but the simple name of Lee has so much weight in the series.
You might want to think of a better Fire Nation cover name. There's a million Lees.
With this Lee, I think you can interpret it as there being a million others like him. Kids who have lost their brothers, lost their mothers, fathers, sisters. Ones living in poverty, just trying to scrape by, while the little they do have is exploited by disgruntled military. Think of someone like Ru, for example. With their village too, basically anyone who posed a threat was just taken away. And what followed was full-blown extortion. But then, there is Zuko.
What's your name?
My name's Lee.
And here, I think you can draw up two separate interpretations, both of which I think totally fit Zuko's narrative. The first is very similar to what we just talked about. Zuko wants to be just another Lee. Just like they cut their own top knots, Zuko denies his heritage, he runs away from his titles. It's almost this way of punishing himself for always being a disappointment. If he was so bad that even his dear mother left him, then he doesn't deserve to be called a prince, he doesn't deserve to be anything. He should just be one of a million Lees. And in the same vein, you could also look at it as there being a million other Zukos who, despite all their titles and birthrights, don't know their place in the world. Iroh would of course later very explicitly vocalize this, but Zuko doesn't know who he wants to be. Even after he returns home in Book 3 and gets all the praise, nothing's changed. He is still the odd one out, and the days spent wandering around the desert as one of a million Lees suddenly seem a lot more appealing. But another, slightly different interpretation I'd offer up is that he adopts the name of this specific Lee. This is already encroaching on the Tales of Ba Sing Se, which, big surprise, I have a whole separate video on, but real fast, it's again that angle of him trying to step away from his title and his true name, but still ending up with one that is full of regret and his own failures. In this episode's narrative, he is unambiguously the hero. He meets this family, repeatedly helps them, and then puts his own life on the line and liberates the town. But even so, his heritage betrays him. As soon as he reveals his bending, all of his accomplishments just vanish. And so during their date, where he is another Lee, he is still carrying around all of that pain. He firebends and he creates beauty for them, but when she goes to kiss him, he pushes away. He's afraid of opening up again. And speaking of him being distant and pushing everyone away, that is of course also what we see here. Obviously the reason he's alone in the first place is because he already pushed Iroh away. But here, the deal he agrees to is also just, yes, I will work for you if you promise not to talk to me and give me some food. Just like we'd see with Jin, when Lee clearly shows interest in learning more about him, he gives the most simple, blunt answers possible because he is afraid of opening up. By the end of the episode, we of course see why. Once again, he got burned. And yes, I admit this is like absolutely a stretch, but I also think them doing the roof could also be another point to show just how rough of a day Zuko's having. One could even say that he is reforging himself. But okay, even if you don't want to be all artsy, this is a literal prince sitting in the scorching heat, hammering nails on an empty stomach. So yes, old Zuzu is struggling big time, and that's what the scene is showing us. He is humble, and there is no pride, he just does what he's supposed to do, and that's it. And on that struggler note, it is time for emotional damage. We fade on over to another flashback of Ursa and Zuko. They're chilling at the pond, and Zuko is replicating Azula, aka being a douche, and immediately gets bitten by the turtle ducks. But Ursa then tells him,
If you mess with their babies, they're gonna bite you back.
Obviously foreshadowing the reason why she disappeared. Azulon was going to have Zuko killed as punishment for Ozai, so Ursa just said, hold my poison, and one-shot the Fire Lord. Okay, memes aside, with this being a memory that Zuko returns to, there is also this tragic undertone that he more than likely has connected the dots himself. He just never wanted to believe it.
Azula always lies.
Azula always lies.
This is yet another paradox in Zuko's character. He wants to feel loved, feel wanted, but he pushes everyone away. He wants to know what happened to his mother, but he refuses the answer. Hold that thought for a second, because there is another flashback here of Azula's trio. We see that Azula is well aware that May likes Zuko, so in typical Azula fashion, she decides that it's time to maximize damage by baiting Zuko into awkwardly quote-unquote saving her. I think this scene right here is another reason why Zuko ended up alone and why he's so afraid of revealing anything about himself. Azula humiliated him time and time again, whether it be bending or her friends or anything. Whenever Zuko tried being himself, Azula just tore into him. Whenever he tried being like Azula, he failed and it backfired. He was stuck in a perpetual cycle of growing more and more defensive and more jaded. Because what could he even be if nothing ever worked? And still dealing with flashbacks, yet another contradiction this episode introduces is with Iroh. By the time we meet him in the series, he's like the coolest uncle like seriously ever. But in this flashback, that goofy, aloof attitude manifests in a far more disturbing way.
If we don't burn it to the ground first. Ah.
So, yeah, Iroh, he might be a very cool dude now, but he was once a very not cool Fire Nation general, and we explore that same contradiction with Zuko. Throughout our time following him, like 90% of the time, he is a full-blown antagonist, period. But this episode shows us that he is just a lonely, broken man desperately trying to find his place in the world. Iroh lost his son, his world completely fell apart, and that loss defined him. Zuko lost his mother, but he never got to truly cope with that loss. It is loss that defines people in the same way that we see with Lee's family. The story of Avatar is about change, and the thing that often spurs change is loss. It's that exact contradiction and crisis of identity that tears Zuko apart, something we'd see very explicitly in Bitter Work, later in the Crystal Catacombs, and eventually him confronting Ozai. And Zuko also gets the Struggler knife with the inscription of "Never give up without a fight," something that of course describes Zuko to a T.
That's who you are, Zuko. Someone who keeps fighting even though it's hard.
Unlike Azula, who has been a prodigy for her entire life, Zuko quite literally wears his scars on his face. Every fight, every failure, every hardship, all of them have brought him here. But like we saw at the start of this episode, even as his consciousness slips away, he will not stop fighting. And what expresses all of this brilliantly are Zuko's broadswords.
Two halves of a single weapon. Don't think of them as separate. They're just two different parts of the same whole.
The blades are twins, but opposites. The same, but fundamentally different. Zuko, the Fire Prince and heir to the throne, and the son of Ursa are the same person, but also worlds apart. Zuko, the banished prince, and Lee are the same person, but also complete strangers. The kid Lee and Zuko's disguise of Lee have both lost their closest in this war. Lee has lost his older brother and Zuko his mother, but their nations are directly opposed. The same, but complete opposites. And to overanalyze even further, it also sets up the duality of Zuko as a brother. Something that is very easy to mix up, done that myself on this very channel by the way, is that Zuko is the older sibling, but contrary to what you would expect, he was always the one played for a fool. He was never a mentor, he was never better at anything, he was a laughingstock for Azula. With Lee on the other hand, Zuko is directly compared to his own older brother, the cool brother who showed him all kinds of things. And like we see with Lee here, this is who Zuko really is. He doesn't get annoyed at the kid for yoinking the swords, nor does he try to threaten him about getting into trouble. He tries actually teaching him. He could have always been a friendly older brother. Problem is, Azula constantly antagonized him, so obviously he didn't want to be the butt of another joke. Returning to the present day, the thugs return and essentially just taunt the family over their supposedly captured son. And here, I think we see that angle of lost sons played up very explicitly, because Zuko knows just how much it hurt Iroh. When Zuko sees a father actually ready to go to war for his son, he can't help but jump in. Despite never feeling a father's true love himself, he is ready to fight so that no one is ever as hurt as Iroh was. And we also see that during another one of their flashbacks. Azula essentially just calls Iroh a wuss for not continuing the siege, whereas Zuko immediately defends him. And keep in mind that during their flashback, Zuko and Iroh are nowhere near as close as they are now. This is just Zuko valuing that fatherly bond because, you know, he has like normal human empathy. And also this scene right here is just like really, really sad.
When my dad goes, will you stay?
Zuko could have been that older brother slash fatherly figure for Lee, but again, he pushes them away. He knows full well that the bullies won't go away on their own. I mean, Azula antagonizes him even today. But even so, he tries just getting away from it all, just getting away from this Lee who actually cares about him. That said though, he does give him the knife, something that is obviously very important for him considering it's one of the very, very few things he's held onto for all this time. Unfortunately, it is just leading to another disappointment because Zuko is like a real struggler. There's also an amusing line from Azula here. She says that Zuko's going to be killed and everything else, and then she says that maybe he could run away and get adopted by an Earth Kingdom family, which I guess does kinda happen, sort of. But finally, all of that is pulled together for the episode climax. Lee's mother runs to Zuko saying he whipped out the knife and was taken by the thugs. And this is where that contradictory, always turbulent Zuko comes into focus. When he first arrives, he is cool and collected. He doesn't try to escalate, he doesn't throw any insults, nothing. This is the Iroh-trained Zuko capable of controlling and restraining that fire within him. Even outnumbered, as they charge him, Zuko meticulously dismantles their attacks with precise moves almost akin to earthbending and sometimes kinda airbending. Even against the Bender dude, he still uses just the swords. He takes hit after hit after hit and keeps using just the swords, just like me in Elden Ring. He refuses firebending, he refuses the crown, and most importantly, he refuses Zuko. But finally, as he's knocked down, we get the final flashback. As we hear footsteps nearing in the background, Ursa wakes him, hugs him, and then just says,
No matter how things may seem to change, never forget who you are.
The mask finally slips and the fire within him roars. The booming Fire Nation motif kicking in as, with a single combo, he absolutely decimates the Bender with what is the first and I believe only time he uses swords to augment his firebending. One blade was Ursa's dear son, the older brother who always wanted to help, the one who understood what it means to lose a son, and just one of a million Lees. The other blade, on the other hand, is Prince Zuko, the rightful heir of the Fire Nation and the son of Ozai. His mother begged him to never lose himself, his true self, and so this is Zuko facing his heritage head on. He doesn't try to push it away, he doesn't wear any masks. When he is asked, he gives them the full title. Zuko, son of Ursa and Fire Lord Ozai, Prince of the Fire Nation and heir to the throne. This is him coming to terms with the fact that no matter how many regrets, how many faults, or even how many bounties he has on his head, he must be complete to truly move on. If he tries to just completely run away from the throne, what kind of legacy is he leaving for his mother? Did she really give it all away just for him to amount to nothing again? He can't do that. And so the banished prince will continue to fight on, because that's just what he does. The dagger in your heart here, of course, being the fact that the Goofy Goober switches sides yet again in the Crystal Catacombs, which is very sad and all. But this is obviously a pivotal turn in the way he thinks about his role in the world. Even after the old man swears at him, screaming that his own father banished and burned him, which, by the way, doesn't actually make any sense because the duel was mostly private and not even Zuko's crew knew what happened, but okay, whatever. He just calmly walks on over to Lee without saying a single word. And again, we have that tragic undertone of how, even in spite of what Zuko has done, his legacy and his title immediately make him the enemy of these people. He saved her son, he fought for them, but mere moments later, she just tells him to get lost and to not come near her son ever again. Zuko doesn't say a single word about it and just bows down to return the gifted knife to Lee, who too rejects it, saying that he hates him. And the very final scene just sees Zuko running through the palace, screaming and shouting for Mom, only to be met with complete silence. Ever since that day, Zuko has been alone. The episode comes full circle as Zuko just wanders into the sunset. He recognizes his true self, faults and all, but he is still not a single step closer to any kind of real closure. And to top it all off, the reason for his mother's disappearance and Zuko now desperately chasing any kind of connection is Ozai and his desire for the throne. Zuko Alone is unique in the sense that most of its storytelling happens through subtext. In terms of spoken dialogue, this episode is very quiet. There is very little explosive conflict, and most of it is just introspection from the primary antagonist. Much like The Storm, it is an episode that allows us to really dive deep into Zuko's psyche to begin to understand how he ended up as the annoying, brash honor man that he is. This was like genuine moral grayness before moral grayness became a meme, and that happened on a Nickelodeon cartoon. In terms of character-centric episodes, I consider this one the strongest in the series, bar none. Even with its pseudo-cyclical storytelling, I think the development we see from Zuko is incredible. And the way it ties all of Zuko's story together, even going past his eventual team-up with Aang, is beautiful. Look, I'm gonna be honest with you, usually with these Avatar videos, I have like a very clever line to leave the episode on, but Zuko Alone is just like really, really good. This is an episode about learning why Zuko is the way he is. There is no massive moment of change, but there also is. It is cyclical, and it's not. That is one of the core paradoxes at the heart of Zuko's character, and that's what makes him so compelling. So like, yeah, Zuko is kind of just really cool, and you should probably watch the episode again. And that's the video. Seems like the Avatar Studios leak season is finally over, but in case you missed any of it, I talked all about the very interesting reveals that seem to be coming out of the next Avatar series on my second channel, Korotos TV. Definitely seems like a bold new approach to whatever they're doing, but I guess we'll have to wait and see what comes next. Also, Season 2 of the live-action version is also steadily moving forward, and very recently we got the excellent news that they'll be reusing the Shogun sets for Season 2, so at least visually, Season 2 will look much better than the volume-centric, I don't even know what to call it, it was like the volume 24/7 Season 1. But yes, I don't cover anything super timely on the main channel, but I do talk about it basically right as it comes out on all of my other channels. But anyway, with that being said, I want to give a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest members of the team, Lulu the Pancake, Queriop, I think, and Glory DeMello. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!